Forget everything Hollywood showed you. The white hat, the noble hero, the clean man on a clean horse riding into a clean sunset. That's a lie. Every single frame of it. The real cowboy didn't look like John Wayne. He didn't smell like leather and freedom. He smelled like cattle blood, 3-week-old sweat, and the wound that hadn't healed right. Imagine riding 16 hours a day in 100-degree heat. Your lips are cracked. Your saddle has rubbed the skin off the inside of your thighs. The man next to you hasn't spoken in 4 days because there is nothing left to say. That's the real West, and it's going to get uncomfortable. We're counting down 20 facts about cowboys that will shatter every myth Hollywood ever sold you. By the end of this list, you will never watch a Western the same way again. Let's start. Number 20. The average cowboy was a teenager. Hollywood gives you rugged men in their 40s, square jaw, deep voice, weathered wisdom. The truth? Most working cowboys were between 15 and 22 years old. 15 years old. Boys who had never shaved, running cattle drives across 800 miles of open desert. Boys who had never been away from home, suddenly sleeping on hard ground with strangers. No roof, no family, no way back. Trail boss Charles Goodnight, one of the most respected men in the cattle industry, wrote in his personal journal that he regularly hired boys who lied about their age just to get work. Some were barely old enough to saddle their own horse without help. They weren't heroes. They were desperate kids doing the only job available. And most of them would be dead or broken before they turned 30. Number 19. The pay was humiliating. In every Western film, the cowboy is his own man, independent, free, answering to nobody. In reality, he was earning between $25 and $40 a month. That's it. For riding up to 18 hours a day, for swimming cattle across flooded rivers, for sleeping on the ground in freezing rain wrapped in a blanket that smelled like a wet dog. $40. A skilled carpenter in the same era earned 3 times that. A factory worker in New York made more money and slept in a bed every night. The cowboy wasn't a symbol of independence. He was cheap labor for cattle barons who owned millions of acres and never once slept outside. The cowboy worked so that someone else could be rich. That part never makes it into the movies. Number 18. The smell would drop you to your knees. This one is sensory, and it's going to hit hard. Picture it. You are standing at the edge of a cattle drive. 3,000 longhorn steers in front of you. The dust alone is so thick that men at the back of the herd ride completely blind, breathing through wet bandanas that stop working after the first hour. Now add the smell. Cattle urine, baking in 90-degree heat. Fresh manure on every surface, including you. Animals that haven't been washed since birth. Cowboys who haven't bathed in 6 weeks. Horses soaked in their own sweat. Dead animals left on the trail because there's no time to bury them. A rancher named George Duffield kept a trail diary in 1866. He described the smell of a cattle drive as something that reaches into your skull and stays there for days. He wrote that after coming home from his first drive, his wife made him undress outside and burn his clothes. Hollywood never shows you the smell, because if they did, nobody would romanticize any of this. Number 17. Most cowboys never fired a gun in anger. The gunfight. The quick draw. 2 men in the street, one walks away. It almost never happened. Real cowboys rarely drew their weapons at all.
Guns were heavy, expensive, and required constant maintenance in dirty conditions. Most trail drives saw 0 gunfights from start to finish. The famous lawman Wyatt Earp, whose life spawned dozens of Hollywood films, was involved in fewer than a handful of genuine shootouts across his entire career. The gunfight at the OK
Corral, the most mythologized moment in Western history, lasted approximately 30 seconds and happened at nearly point-blank range. It was ugly. It was chaotic. 3 men died. Nobody drew fast. Nobody was cool. Historical records from frontier newspapers almost never mention duels. They mention accidents. Men shot themselves cleaning their guns. Men were killed by their own horses. Men drowned crossing rivers. The West wasn't won by fast draws. It was ground down by bad luck and slow suffering. Number 16. The food was rotting. Here's where it gets physically uncomfortable. Imagine your entire diet for 4 months consisting of hardtack biscuits so stiff they could crack a tooth, dried beef that had already begun to turn, beans cooked in the same pot every day without washing it, and black coffee made with river water. That's breakfast. That's lunch. That's dinner. The chuck wagon cook, the most important man on any cattle drive, was working with limited supplies and no refrigeration. Meat spoiled fast in summer heat. Flour got wet and molded. Beans had weevils in them so commonly that cowboys stopped trying to pick them out. Army surgeon reports from frontier posts in the 1870s documented widespread malnutrition among working cowboys. Scurvy, the disease sailors got from lack of vitamin C, appeared in cowboys hundreds of miles from the ocean. Scurvy. In the American West, men losing teeth, bleeding from their gums, too weak to lift a saddle, because there were no vegetables on the trail, and nobody cared enough to change that. But it gets worse. Number 15. The whiskey could blind you. Every saloon in every Western is warm and inviting. Amber bottles, cheerful bartenders, smooth whiskey glowing in lamplight. What they were actually drinking had a different name out west. They called it Taos Lightning. They called it Coffin Varnish. They called it Who Hit John. These weren't poetic nicknames. They were warnings. Frontier whiskey in the 1870s and 1880s was frequently adulterated. Distillers added tobacco, red pepper, gunpowder, and, in some documented cases, actual poisonous chemicals to make the alcohol feel stronger and go further. Methanol contamination, the kind of alcohol poisoning that causes permanent blindness, was not rare in frontier saloons. Frontier newspapers from Texas and Kansas reported cases of men going partially or completely blind after a night of drinking. And yet, they kept drinking. Because when you spend 16 hours a day in a saddle, surrounded by death and dirt and silence, the only thing that makes the night survivable is the bottle, even if the bottle is trying to kill you. Number 14. 1 in 3 cowboys was not white. Hollywood's West is almost entirely white. This is a lie so thorough, so complete, that it counts as historical erasure. Historians estimate that between 1/4 and 1/3 of all working cowboys in the post-Civil War American West were black men. Freed slaves, or the sons of freed slaves, who moved west because west was the only direction that offered any kind of new start. Men like Nat Love, who taught himself to read while working cattle, became one of the most celebrated ropers in the Southwest, and wrote his own autobiography in 1907, which almost nobody read because the publishing world wasn't interested in a black cowboy's story. Men like Bose Eichard, who was the personal trail partner and most trusted friend of Charles Goodnight himself. Goodnight wrote on Eichard's gravestone that Eichard had surpassed all men he had ever known in loyalty and courage. He wrote it on a gravestone, because during Eichard's lifetime, the world didn't want to see it. Approximately 15 to 20% of cowboys were also Mexican vaqueros, the men who invented most of the tools and techniques that the American cowboy later became famous for. The lasso, the word rodeo, the style of saddle, the entire culture of cattle herding in the American West, borrowed from Mexican vaqueros, given to a white myth. Number 13. The horses died by the hundreds. You love the horse in Westerns. Everyone does. The bond between man and animal, the loyalty, the silent partnership across open plains. Here is what actually happened to horses on a cattle drive. They were worked until they broke. A typical trail drive required each cowboy to have a string of 5 to 8 horses in rotation, because a single horse could not survive the workload of even one full day of cattle driving before going lame. Horses were ridden across rocky ground in shoes that wore down faster than they could be replaced. They were driven into flooded rivers, whether they were willing or not. They broke legs in prairie dog holes and were shot on the spot because there was no time to treat them. The Chisholm Trail, the most famous cattle route in American history, running from Texas to Kansas, was lined with the bones of horses for its entire 800-mile length. You could navigate by the bones. That's not a metaphor. Pioneer accounts describe it literally. The bones were landmarks. Hollywood shows you one horse, one loyal companion, one meaningful look between man and animal. The real West went through horses the way you go through paper cups. Number 12. The loneliness was a form of madness. Cowboys in the movies are quiet and stoic. Their silence is noble. Their solitude is strength. In reality, the isolation of cattle work produced something closer to psychological damage. Psychiatrist and historian Terry G. Jordan, researching frontier mental health in the 1980s, found that long-term cowboys showed patterns of behavior we would today associate with severe social withdrawal, depression, and in some cases, dissociative episodes. A trail drive could mean 4 months with the same 8 men, in silence broken only by cattle sounds and weather. No news from home. No letters. No way to know if your family was alive or dead. No conversation that went beyond logistics. Diaries from cowboys who could write, and many could not, describe stretching periods of complete emotional numbness. Men who stopped feeling anything. Men who described themselves as hollow. One Texas drover wrote in 1881, "I have forgotten the sound of a woman's voice. I have forgotten what it feels like to sit in a chair. I am not sure I am the same man who left." He rode cattle for 11 more years after writing that. Nobody checked on him. Nobody thought to. And that's where the real hell begins. Number 11. Cattle stampedes were pure terror. Hollywood stampedes look almost beautiful. Thundering hooves, dramatic chase. The hero rides hard, fires a shot, turns the herd. Here is what a real stampede felt like from ground level. 3,000 longhorn cattle, each one weighing over 1,000 pounds, horns spanning 6 feet, suddenly accelerating in the dark. Because a lightning strike spooked them, because a coyote got too close, because one cow stumbled, and the panic spread in seconds. You have approximately no time. Cowboys who were caught on foot during a stampede had no survivable options. The cattle did not go around obstacles, they went through them. Bodies found after frontier stampedes were sometimes unrecognizable, not injured, erased. Even on horseback, survival was not guaranteed. Your horse could go down. A steer could hit you from the side at full speed. Trail accounts from the 1870s describe cowboys riding parallel to a moving stampede in complete darkness, screaming into the noise to try to curve the herd, unable to see anything, riding entirely by feel, knowing that if their horse stepped wrong, it was over. They didn't do this for glory. They did it because if the cattle scattered, the drive failed, and they wouldn't get paid. $40. Number 10. Disease killed more cowboys than bullets. No dramatic last stand, no enemy with a face, just your body shutting down in the dirt. Dysentery was so common on the trail that cowboys developed their own dark slang for it. They called it the scours. They called it the quick step. They joked about it because they had no other way to deal with it. Men rode for days while severely dehydrated, their bodies expelling fluids they couldn't replace, unable to stop or slow down because the cattle didn't stop. Cholera swept through trail camps when water sources were contaminated, which was often. The bacteria traveled in rivers that cattle and men both drank from. In 1867, multiple trail drives on the Chisholm Trail lost between 5 and 15% of their total crew to disease before reaching Kansas. Not to gunfights, to water. Typhoid, pneumonia, infections from minor wounds that had no access to medical care and no antiseptic. A cut from a barbed wire fence, left untreated for 2 weeks in Texas summer heat, could kill a man as surely as a bullet. The graveyards along cattle trails held men who died of infected blisters. That is the actual West. Number 9. The cattle barons despised cowboys. The mythology says the cowboy was free, his own man, beholden to nobody. But somebody owned the cattle. Somebody owned the land. Somebody owned the horses, the chuck wagon, the supplies, and the roots. The cattle barons of Texas and Kansas, men like Shanghai Pierce and the XIT Ranch Syndicate, which controlled 3 million acres, viewed cowboys as disposable equipment. Not employees, equipment. Cowboys could be fired with no notice, no pay for the days they had already worked, and no way to recover their costs if they had purchased their own gear. They had no legal protections, no contracts, no union. In the 1880s, a group of Texas Panhandle cowboys staged one of the first labor strikes in American history. They called it the Cowboy Strike of 1883. They demanded wages of $50 a month and better working conditions. The cattle barons fired every single one of them, blacklisted them across the entire industry. Not one of those cowboys ever worked a major cattle ranch again. The myth of the free cowboy was invented, in large part, by the cattle barons themselves. A free man doesn't need a union. A free man doesn't complain. A free man can be paid $40 and be grateful. Number 8. The violence was ugly, random, and meaningless. Hollywood violence is choreographed. It means something. The right man wins. Justice is served. Real frontier violence was stupid. A man in Abilene, Kansas, in 1871 was killed in a saloon argument over which of 2 strangers had been first in line for a drink. The argument lasted 4 minutes. The shooting lasted 4 seconds. Nobody remembered the dead man's name by the following morning. Lawman Wild Bill Hickok accidentally shot and killed his own deputy, Mike Williams, during a gunfight in Abilene that same year. Williams had run toward the fight to help. Hickok, turning in the noise and chaos, didn't recognize him in time. He never fully recovered from it. This is the real story of Western violence. Chaos, accidents, men who weren't the villain dying first, men who weren't the hero walking away. The Pinkerton Agency, the private detective force hired by cattle barons and railroad companies to enforce order, killed more innocent bystanders and unarmed farm workers than they ever did actual criminals. But they were on the side of money, so history called them law enforcement. But it gets worse. Number 7. The Cowboy Code was a marketing invention. The Cowboy Code. Honesty, courage, respect for women, never shoot a man in the back. It sounds ancient, sacred, like something passed down through generations of genuine frontier tradition. It was written in 1934 by a man named Gene Autry. Gene Autry was a singing cowboy actor who made movies for Hollywood. His Cowboy Code, 10 Rules for How a Cowboy Should Behave, was a public relations document, a brand identity, something to sell to children and parents who were consuming Western entertainment during the Depression. Real cowboys stole from each other. Real cowboys cheated at cards. Real cowboys took things from native settlements that did not belong to them and faced no legal consequences. The actual ethical culture of the frontier was closer to survive by whatever means available than any Ten Commandment code of noble behavior. A diary from a Texas trail boss in 1876 describes in plain, unapologetic terms how his crew stole water from a rival outfit's barrels, then lied about it to the trail marshal. They were not troubled by this, because out there, survival trumped everything. The code came later, when there was money to be made from the myth. Number 6. Native Americans weren't the villains. This is the myth Hollywood has the most blood on its hands for. For a century of Western films, Native Americans were the danger, the attacking force, the obstacle to civilization. Here is what was actually happening. The cattle trails, the railroad routes, and the settler expansion that defined the cowboy era were moving directly through lands that had been formally guaranteed to native nations by signed United States government treaties. Not informally, not by assumption, by signed legal documents. And then the government broke them. Systematically. Every single one. The Comanche, the Sioux, the Apache, the Cheyenne. They weren't attacking settlers out of savagery. They were defending territory that had been legally, contractually promised to them, from people who came with weapons and the backing of a government that had decided the contracts no longer applied. Meanwhile, the cowboys, the heroes of the myth, were often the direct instrument of that displacement. Cattle drives destroyed native hunting grounds. Longhorn herds ate the grass that sustained bison populations. Bison were then systematically hunted to near extinction as a deliberate military strategy to starve the Plains nations into submission. General Philip Sheridan said it openly. He encouraged hide hunters to kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. He called it the only way to bring lasting peace. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a quote from a general in official military correspondence. Hollywood made it a Western. History made it a genocide. Number 5. The end of the cowboy era was pathetic. Every myth needs a worthy ending. The cowboy myth demands a sunset,
a final ride into something dignified. The real end of the cowboy era was a business decision. Barbed wire. In 1874, a farmer from Illinois named Joseph Glidden patented a new kind of wire fence. Cheap, effective, able to contain cattle without the need for open-range driving. Within a decade, barbed wire had been strung across hundreds of thousands of miles of previously open land.
The open range, which was never actually free land to begin with, was divided, fenced, sold. The long cattle drive became economically unnecessary as rail lines extended further south, closer to the ranches. By 1890, the era of the Great Cattle Drive was essentially over. Not because the cowboy retired in glory, because he became obsolete. The young men who had spent their teenage years riding the Chisholm Trail were in their 30s now. Their bodies were wrecked. Their skills were suddenly worthless. There was no pension, no severance, no acknowledgement. Many of them drifted into farm labor. Some ended up in Wild West shows, playing a caricature of themselves for Eastern audiences who had never seen the actual West and preferred the performance. Buffalo Bill Cody made millions. The cowboys who performed in his show earned $12 a week. Number 4. The women were invisible to history. Every Hollywood saloon has its women. Decorative, dangerous, defined entirely by their relationship to men. The real women of the frontier West are almost completely absent from the mythology. Not because they weren't there, because history chose not to record them as significant. Women ran homesteads alone for months while their husbands drove cattle. They handled livestock, repaired structures, defended their property, made every financial decision, and kept families alive in conditions that regularly broke grown men. Mary Ann Stagecoach Mary Fields was a black woman who became the first African-American female postal carrier in United States history, driving her route through Montana winters that reached 40 below zero, reportedly refusing to leave her route unfinished, regardless of weather or threat. The newspapers of her time described her primarily as eccentric. Women like Henrietta Chamberlain King, who built the King Ranch in Texas into a business empire after her husband's death, were systematically described in historical accounts as having continued her husband's vision. She expanded the ranch. She made the decisions. She ran the operation for decades. But the ranch still bears his name, because the myth required men. And here is where the story twists into something that should genuinely disturb you. Number 3. The Wild West shows invented the cowboy. You know everything you picture when you hear the word cowboy: the hat, the boots, the revolver on the hip, the dramatic gesture, the noble posture. Most of it came not from the actual frontier. It came from a circus. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show launched in 1883, just as the real cattle era was dying. It toured America and Europe for decades. It performed for Queen Victoria. It sold out Madison Square Garden. And it was theatrical fiction. The costumes were exaggerated. The gunfights were choreographed. The frontier scouts were performers. The Native Americans who appeared in the show were hired actors, many of them from nations that had been defeated and confined to reservations, paid to reenact their own conquest as entertainment. Sitting Bull himself traveled with Buffalo Bill's show for a season. Let that sit for a moment. One of the greatest leaders in Lakota history, appearing in a traveling entertainment spectacle, signing autographs for white audiences who had watched a dramatized version of his people's defeat. He earned $50 a week. He reportedly gave most of it away to the street children he saw in eastern cities during the tour. The Wild West show was a lie. The myth it created became American identity. And the actual men who had actually ridden the actual trails, most of them already broken, poor, and forgotten, watched it happen from the outside. Number 2. The Cowboys knew they were living a myth while it was happening. This is the detail that haunts everything else. They knew. Historians who have analyzed personal diaries, letters, and interviews from working cowboys of the 1870s and 1880s found consistent evidence that many of them were already aware of the gap between their real lives and the stories being told about them. Eastern magazines like Harper's Weekly and the Police Gazette were publishing romanticized cowboy stories as early as the 1870s. Dime novels, cheap popular fiction, turned cowboys into heroes, while the actual cowboys were still alive and still working. A cowboy named Charles Siringo, one of the first cowboys to write a genuine memoir, published in 1885 while he was still in his 30s, described reading a dime novel about a cattle drive and then looking at his own hands. He wrote, "I laughed, then I didn't." He couldn't explain why it stopped being funny, but you understand, don't you? To know that the story being told about your life is beautiful, and to know that the actual life, the smell, the pain, the $40, the boys who didn't make it back, is something the story has no room for. To be invisible inside your own legend, that is its own kind of violence. Number 1. The cowboy was a worker. Just a worker. Here it is, the final fact, the one that reframes everything above it. Not a hero, not a symbol, not a myth. A seasonal laborer. That's the historical category. Seasonal agricultural laborer. Identical in economic terms to the migrant farm worker of any other era, dependent on employers who held all the power, paid the minimum survivable wage, discarded when the season ended. The cowboy was manufactured into a symbol of American independence at the precise historical moment when American independence was being most aggressively concentrated in the hands of a very small number of very wealthy men. The Gilded Age, the robber barons, the railroad monopolies, the land consolidations. While Carnegie and Rockefeller were building empires that would define American economic inequality for generations, the myth of the self-made individual frontier hero was being sold to the working class. A man who owns nothing can still feel like a free man if the story tells him he is. The white hat, the open plains, the noble silhouette against the sunset. It was never about the cowboy. It was about making the cowboy feel like something other than what he was. The myth was the product. The cowboy was the one who paid for it. The final. The West was not won. It was extracted. It was fenced. It was performed. It was sold back to the people who built it as a fantasy version of themselves. Every time Hollywood puts a clean man on a clean horse, it is doing the same thing the dime novels did in 1875. The same thing the Wild West show did in 1883. It is selling you a story that keeps you from asking who owned the cattle, who signed the contracts, and who got buried without a name marker along the Chisholm Trail. The cowboy didn't ride off into the sunset. He aged out. He got sick. He went broke. He watched someone else get famous for his life. And somewhere in a Montana boarding house in 1910, an old man with ruined knees and no savings watched a Wild West show poster go up on the wall across the street. And he thought about what it felt like to really be out there. The smell, the cold, the boy he was when it started. and nobody asked him about any of it. So here's your question. Which fact broke something in you? Was it the boys who were 15 years old? The men who went blind from the whiskey? The code that was invented in Hollywood? Or was it the last one? The idea that the greatest symbol of American freedom was always, underneath everything, just a man doing a hard job for someone else's profit. Tell me in the comments. And stay close, because in the next video, we go somewhere even darker. We're going to talk about what really happened to the towns the Cowboys built. The diseases, the collapses, the ghost towns that swallowed entire communities in less than a decade. It's going to be worse. It always is.